del problema de infraestructura que empezamos tarde. Es el panel número 6, Ciencia, Tecnología y Educación. Tenemos a Steve Lyndsay, a Mari Carmen Pereira Uceda y a Lucía Osa Melero. Voy a empezar presentando a cada uno brevemente antes de su ponencia. Stephen Joseph Lyndsay, Chemical Engineer, the primary aluminium industry, a century in Spain. Stephen Lyndsay, born in New York, lives in Tennessee. He graduated from Clarkson College of Technology 1979 in chemical engineer and went to have a long career with Alcoa that began at Macena operations, primary aluminum technical specialist. He retired at the end of 2018 and is a world-recognized expert on pollution control systems, aluminum oxide properties, and best practices for primary aluminum smelters. He now works part-time with Hatch, a global engineering firm. Steve Joseph Lyndsay is a member of NAFTA, thank you, the National Aluminum Production Heritage Association, and is proud to be a part of disseminating the rich history of aluminum production. Steve has published more than 3 dozen technical articles in aluminum production in the proceedings and various technical conferences and journals. He is the co-inventor of 2 patents and has co-authored a book titled Smelter Grade Alumina from Bauxite, bla 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 bla. Steve Lyndsay. Es un privilegio porque es un especialista mundialmente conocido. Welcome.
I present like I usually do for conferences. Y lo siento porque mi presentación está en inglés. No puedo decirlo en español, so I hope it's not a problem. The idea is to get more diversity and among different disciplines into ALDEEU, and I was requested to prepare a paper. As Margarita mentioned, I work a lot with technical things and also with the history of the primary aluminum industry since I retired from Alcoa back in 2018. So this is to mark an upcoming century anniversary for the anniversary of 100 years of the industry in Spain. I've already said a few things about me. Since I retired, I worked with some organizations that are nonprofits, some that have to do with history, and consult and work with some engineering companies. It's just all part-time bits and pieces. So, on the 21st of August of this year will be the 100th anniversary of the industry in Spain. It was on that day in 1925 that the primary aluminum industry started with Aluminio Español S.A. And it was formed in order to build the very first primary aluminum smelter in Spain. The industry was still quite young at that time, only about 37 years old, but it was expanding into new countries to help to meet the demand that was developing in local markets. And over the course of the next 5 decades, a total of 5 primary aluminum smelters would be built in España. At the peak of the industry, between the years 1979 and 1983, remarkably, all 5 of the smelters that were built in this country were in operation at the same time, which is quite rare within the industry. But at this time, only one of those smelters remains, and it's operating at greatly reduced capacity at this moment. Ironically, what was hoped to help save the industry and to extend it in Spain through renewable energy now is posing a threat to the continued operation of San Ciprián in Galicia and the industry in Spain, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. A little bit about the industry. Primary aluminum was a very valuable metal before the modern process was developed. It was invented in 1886 at about the same moment by both of these men. One is Charles Martin Hall, who was a chemist, a young student from the United United States, and his invention happened when he was 22 years old, which is somewhat remarkable. And Paul-Louis Toussaint from Paris, and his invention happened just a few weeks after he turned 23. So almost at exactly the same age, with a very similar process design. And the coincidences don't end there. They were both born in the same year, both died in the same year at the same age. But in personalities and actions, they were actually quite different. This young man was more of a chemist, and this young man was more of an engineer. Now, the texts and the things that are in the public domain often state that the key to their success was to figure out that aluminum oxide, something called alumina, could be dissolved in a molten salt that was mined from Greenland called cryolite. Cryo means cold, lithe means stone. It basically meant ice stone in the Danish language, and actually back to the Greek language. But in fact, that wasn't their discovery. It had been discovered by a different Frenchman, Henri Sinclair de Ville, in France, before either one of these gentlemen were born. The key to their success was their persistence in their ideas and invention, and especially being able to tie it to a new device that could produce large amounts of electrical power. And that device was called the dynamo. Prior to that, electrical energy was pretty much only being provided by homemade batteries. So, electricity was the key. Let's talk about that a little bit. Each one of these bundles here is 1 metric ton. And a lot of electricity is required to produce 1 ton of metal. It takes almost 2 tons of aluminum oxide, but the average amount of energy to make this 1 ton is more than 14,000 kilowatt hours, which sounds like a big number, but it's hard to relate to, because we can't really hold kilowatt hours in our hands. To put it another way, in order to make 1 ton, it's enough energy to take a basic electric vehicle, like the Tesla 3, and drive it around the Earth at the equator more than 2.5 times. So it's a tremendous amount of energy. And to remain competitive, aluminium smelters have to have access to very large amounts of energy at reasonable prices, and it has to be sustainable because the process is hot. It's almost at 1,000 degrees C. And if everything cools off, if the power goes out and the lights go out too, and things get cold, then they have to basically start over again. And the cost of that is just tremendous. It's well beyond the tens of millions of euros, more like 100 million euros to restart a large smelter. So they have to operate 365 days per year. Now, the very first smelter that was built in Spain was in Sabiñánigo, in Aragon. It was a consortium of owners from the 3 largest aluminum companies at the time. They all had fairly long names at that moment, but they were the forerunners of the Aluminum Company of America, Aluminium S.A. from France, and ALDEEU from Switzerland, and also ownership in Germany. Aside from being the very first primary aluminum smelter in Spain, this is the smelter, the pot rooms, and it's easy to pick these out because they're very elongated buildings, and the roofs are black. What about this being black? Well, the rest of them have snow on them, but the process generates a lot of heat. And that energy that I spoke of a moment ago, about half of it escapes the process as heat loss, and the other half goes into making aluminium. So you can often pick out a building, especially in wintertime conditions. But aside from being the first smelter in Spain, it was the very first that used a new technology that had been developed at the end of World War I, called Soderberg technology with self-baking anodes. A Swedish person, Carl Wilhelm Soderberg, had invented it due to shortages of graphite. And the aluminum was made in these round devices that were referred to as cubas in Spain, that came from the word pots in the English language, because these were often called reduction pots, although they don't look like pots and pans so much, they're much bigger than that. Now, smelters that had been built in the world in the 30-some years prior to Sabignanico had used lots of individual cylindrical anodes that were maybe 1/2 meter long. This is a picture from where I live, Tennessee operations at Alcoa, and all of these pots were tended by hand. There's a frozen crust of this frozen salt and alumina on the surface, and the anodes were connected with metal rods of copper. And these gentlemen would tend to the pots, break in the crust, change the anodes by hand, with lots of electricity passing through. The Soderberg anodes were developed, as I mentioned, because of the graphite shortage, and they look something like this. They're cylindrical, that were formed inside of a shaft. Loose paste, a mixture of coke and pitch, was put into the top, and then by gravity it would fall down, and as it came closer to the process, this is a steel furnace, not an aluminum furnace, but as it came closer to the place where it's about 1,000 degrees C, it would get so warm inside the casing that it would self-bake and become hard. These are the actual type of pots that were used in Sabignanico. This photo is actually from Tennessee operations, the same place as here. And you can see a round profile of these individual anodes that were used, that were called Soderbergs. Sabignanico had about 60 of these type of cylinders. Then the second smelting technology was developed, and it was also developed, I should mention the first one was developed and installed by Alcoa, the second by Aluminium S.A. Developed during occupation in World War II in southern France. This was a larger Soderberg anode. It wasn't inside of a large tube, it was inside of a forming device here with metal rods that would stick down into the anode to conduct the electricity, and because they would also adhere to the anode material when it baked, it would hold the anode mechanically. This was for the second smelter of Spain that was put into Valladolid. It was about twice the size of the previous one and used 25 kiloamperes versus 12. So we had gone from about 80 kilos per pot per day to more than double that at 170. And like Sabignanico, it was another first in the industry. It was the very first greenfield or newly built aluminum smelter to use this technology anywhere in the world. So Spain had two of the very firsts in the industry. And this is a photo of workers at the factory in Valladolid in about 1950 to 1952. Now, Sabignanico had been built for profit by those three companies that I mentioned. Valladolid had different objectives. The I&I that had been established in the post-Civil War era developed a number of companies to boost economic activity inside of Spain. One was called Endesa, which was for the primary aluminum industry. It had been intended originally to use natural resources, a material called bauxite that's mined from the ground, to produce alumina, but it turned out that the bauxite that was domestically available was too high in a contaminant called titanium. And that titanium would make the aluminum too high in resistivity and not good for electrical conducting cables like you see with high tension towers. The idea was if Spain could achieve this with domestic materials, they wouldn't have to use the little bit of capital they had in order to buy copper for conduction of electricity, as electrical distribution systems were just being created at that time, and copper wasn't available in Spain. So much needed capital was leaving the country unless they could produce their own aluminum. So in the end, the alumina wasn't made from bauxite from here. It was imported from Péchiney in France, and power was supplied for this smelter from the Ricobio hydroelectric station in Zamora. This is a photo of Franco, obviously, inaugurating the Valladolid smelter in, I believe it was March of 1950. And DASA didn't stop in Valladolid. It built another smelter in Asturias, very close to Avilés. And that came about 8 years later, and they doubled the size of the pots, or the cubas that had been used in Valladolid, going from 50 to 500 kiloampere vertical stud Soderberg reduction cells. And that doubled the amount of production. We'd gone from 80 kilos per day, now up to 340. By 1954, Valladolid had upgraded to 50 Ka reduction cells. They had sold off their 25 Ka cells that they put in just 4 years before, but they were so new that they had some value. And they asked Aluminio Español S.A, would you like to have these to boost your production? And in 1953, they said, yes, we would like to take those. So by growing the industry within DASA and Valladolid, also helped to support the industry growth and the growth of the economy in Spain and Sabiñánigo. Avilés didn't stop with his first 50 kiloampere pot line. This is a pot room where all of these individual pots are connected in a series circuit. If you're old enough like me and remember Christmas lights where one went out and they all went out, that's a series circuit where they're all connected. The same is true for a pot line. Avilés eventually added 2 more pot lines with larger capacity, not 50 kiloamperes. The second pot line was 116, the third at 123 kiloamperes, and those went in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. After those had been installed, Avilés became the largest producer of aluminium in España at 99,000 metric tons per year. So the industry is starting to be quite healthy, and all of the locations were operating as close as they could to their peak capacity. La Coruña followed Avilés, and now we're back from supporting the industry and the growth of the economy in the post-Civil War era back to profit motive again. Aluminium Péchiney liked to have his fingers in Spain. They sold alumina to Spain, they sold much of the pot technology to Spain, technical support to Spain. So they were receiving a lot of income from that, but they weren't quite satisfied. They had wanted to have a piece of the Avilés smelter, but Endasa and the INI had said no. So they said, okay, we'll form another company and build one, another in Galicia, that was near La Coruña. Operations began there with very similar amperage to what we saw at Avilés, 107 kiloamperes. Again, vertical stud Soderberg reduction cells. That was in 1962. And they added a second pot line to this first one. And this is what a pot of that size looks like. In 1974, it had 124 kiloamperes, which we had gone from 80 Ka at the beginning, or 80 kilograms per pot per day at the beginning, to 11 times that with this capacity. So bigger and bigger cells, more and more production, and a tremendous amount of energy consumption. I'm not sure about Coruña, but at its peak, the smelter in Valladolid was consuming about 40% of all the electricity in Castilla y León. Now, since the shutdown of the original cells that happened in 1959 at Sabiñánigo, we had 8 generations of Péchiney's vertical stud technology that had operated in Spain. All of these were sideworks, which means the aluminum was laid down along the side and broken in to go into solution to be dissolved and converted to aluminium. But things were about to change. And that takes us to the fifth smelter. Prior to this time, even though ALDEEU was producing 99,000 metric tons per year, the demand internally in España was increasing, and we're still having to import both alumina from France and aluminium to support domestic consumption. But when San Ciprián began operations in early 1979, it had its own co-located alumina refinery that started a year later, and all of a sudden the industry in Spain went from being an importer of alumina and aluminium to a net producer and exporter of both. Each of the reduction cells shown here at San Ciprián were rated for 140,000 amperes and were producing at the whole plant about 200,000 metric tons per year, or 200 times more than the original rated capacity of Aluminium. Instead of 80 kilos per day, these cells could produce a little over 1 metric ton per pot day. And they didn't use the Soderberg anodes anymore. These went back to the original concept of baking the anodes beforehand. And I wish I could show some more pictures for the sake of time. I don't have them except in the paper, which is quite extensive and has a lot of illustration. The Soderberg process was great as far as capitalism was concerned. It cost less to build a smelter, but it exposed the workers to a lot of carcinogenic materials, which post-World War I, that wasn't understood. But as time passed and people started to have health issues, it became more and more understood that exposure to fumes from coal tar pitch was not the best thing in the world. So that was during the golden age of production pretty much everywhere in the world. This graph contrasts España to los Estados Unidos. You can see that from 1927 to 1979, the number of smelters in operation was growing, except this one period during the Civil War when Aluminium was shut down for a little over 6 months. And then after 1983, there was a step down, and for a short period in the recent years, there was no production happening in Spain. Not exactly the same profile for the same time frame or a different time frame in the United States, but the peak also was in early 1980s. With Spain, it's a smaller country than the US. The per capita consumption of metal is about the same. So 5 smelters operating consecutively in España correlated to 32 smelters at its peak in the United States. Now the United States only has 4 that remain in operation. What made that happen? Well, economic recessions during the 1980s kind of started it, and those were on the heels of the first energy crisis for petrol in the 1970s. That reduction in the economy reduced the price of aluminium in the market by 1/2. In 1978, aluminium had become a commodity and it was traded globally. It was not controlled anymore by the individual producing companies. So that was a big negative producer or negative impactor, and power prices began to rise. Aluminium needed to shut down because it couldn't compete anymore. So on the 16th of February of 1983, it produced its last metal and converted to becoming a foil mill that still operates today, called ALDEEU. Next, 2 years later, by ALDEEU, the entire smelter, and pot line 1 of ALDEEU closed due to the same reasons. Energy prices were important, but also the age of the assets becomes important for being competitive. This graph shows the individual type of cells that were used and the duration of years in service that we had in España. The one in San Ciprián is not shaded in because it's still in operation. But the typical life for cells or for technology is about 35 or 36 years. And if you take out the exception of ALDEEU, where they actually sold these pots to Aluminio, the average goes up to closer to 40 years of service. In the US, it's about the same. With everything included, these were World War II plants that operated between 1 and 2 years only. The average was 35, but with everything considered, the average is about 40 years for an asset. That's pretty good because the industry, as you've seen in the presentation, keeps growing and growing, and the bigger, more modern smelters are more competitive, and the older smelters fade away. So, 40 years. San Ciprián began operations in 1979. We're more than 40 years now, 46. And things haven't been so good. Avilés beat the odds, went beyond 40 years and closed after 60 years of operations. Perunia very close to that at 57. But the smelters are no longer competitive. A big part of that was the energy cost. Here it looks low by comparison to the spikes, but 50 euros per megawatt hour was about double what others were paying in other countries to produce aluminium. And with so much energy required to make a ton of metal, the smelters ended up with sad looking photos like this after they were shut down. I used to have the pleasure of visiting both of these when they were in operation, and it's sad for me to see these photos. Even San Ciprián was negatively affected after 43 years of operation due to these large spikes in power prices, where it was reported in some newspapers that they had gone from losing like 20 million euros per year back in this period to 20 million euros per month when power prices were this high. So Alcoa shut down or temporarily curtailed San Ciprián, the last smelter operating, and had promised to resume operations 2 years later, which they did. But I think a lot of people were thinking the entire smelter would restart, and it didn't. Only 32 of the 512 production cells they had. Could they afford the energy to bring it back? None of the workers were put out. They were all kept during this time. That was part of the agreement. And we thought, with great hope, on the 1st of April of this year, when Alcoa partnered with an energy company called Ignis, on the 1st of April, that a full restart was announced and it was getting ready to begin quite fast. Coincidentally, about 2 weeks later, Spain celebrated its first weekday with 100% of its energy production coming from renewable sources, mostly solar and wind. And less than 2 weeks after that, Iberia, the entire Iberian Peninsula lost power for between 8 to 10 hours, and it negatively affected San Ciprián. They had been able to get to 41 reduction cells in operation, but because of the duration of more than 8 hours of power off, they dropped back to only 14 cells that they could save, which is where they're operating as of yesterday. So electric power grids are designed for having, supporting alternating current, and renewables produce direct current, and mixing those two requires the development of new technology, which hasn't really been developed yet. So this is one of the things that's thought to have caused the issue here with the power outage in Spain, and it has become a threat to industries that have to consume large amounts of power, like San Ciprián. So España's 100th anniversary of the industry will be celebrated on the 21st of August, but its 100th year of production, which would be on the 14th of November in 2027, is now an open question if we'll be able to celebrate that anniversary.